Hello everyone, you're watching Let's Talk About Prepping. I'm Tyler, your host, and in this video, I'm going to share my ideas on what society should do to be rebuilt after crap has hit the fan.
Alright, so this topic is one of the ones that's been covered by the Prepper Trifecta. That's a project going on by Eric from Ruled Wasteland, JJ from Reality Survival Prepping, and Shay from Prepper Logic, where they do collabs on topics like what to do when crap hits the fan, group rules after crap hits the fan, and now how to rebuild society after crap hits the fan. And they do a live stream chat on the topics, and they encourage others to do videos and cover the same. Now, I'm usually working on my own video when they do these, and they usually cover them real well, so I haven't done a video response to these yet. But I decided to do this one because I really came at this from a completely different angle than the others did. I interpreted it a little bit differently, and I wasn't really going to talk about it until Huples Cat did his VR, and it really got me thinking about the thoughts that I had, and I decided to share them. Now, the other guys, when they came at this topic of how to rebuild society after the crap has hit the fan and things are stabilizing, seem to come at it from the perspective of what they would do to contribute to society being rebuilt after crap has hit the fan, or what they, as leaders of a rather large mutual assistant group organization, would do to help to rebuild society in their local area or to contribute to their state or region's society being rebuilt. Each of them had sort of low level individual group things that they would suggest or have going on. And each of them also had suggestions from sort of a top down perspective of what society itself should be doing. And in his video response, Hoople's Cat sort of broadened this a bit by looking at a lot of broad scope items that should be going on. But this really got me thinking of some of the really, really big picture stuff that society should be doing. And I think the reason that nobody else really addressed this is because we all know that from our individual position in that situation, we will not have, and maybe nobody will have, the scope of influence to change anything at a full societal level. So, from that perspective, it could be sort of difficult to imagine how anybody could shape society after crap has hit the fan and everything has fallen apart. But whenever I first approached this topic, when I read that they were going to be doing a top 10 rules to rebuild society, I came at this from a totally top down perspective. How a president or somebody at the top level of the nation at that point would want to go about rebuilding society. I have often liked reading fiction where the characters end up leading nations, and I've often enjoyed playing strategy games like Age of Empires or SimCity or StarCraft. And that does not make me qualified to talk about rebuilding or leading a society, but it is why I leapt right to this type of thinking when they were talking about rebuilding a society. So, to facilitate my mode of thinking, I sort of imagined a situation where I end up on a ham radio and I'm talking to the provisional president of the United States who's sitting in Cheyenne Mountain or the Denver airport or whatever have you, and he has no clue what he's supposed to do, and a bunch of generals who are trying to take advantage of him, and he wants my advice on what the nation should do to reestablish itself. Or maybe I've ended up at the Denver airport and I've been made president by a bunch of people who think they can make me a puppet, and so I'm going to do what I think should be done. Or maybe some guy named John Galt approaches me tomorrow because of my YouTube channel and wants my advice on what a splinter society should do to run itself. Whatever the reason, I'm imagining that I need to give orders to all the people who are alive in the country after crap has hit the fan and order has somewhat been reestablished. First, I'd like to share a little bit of background on the circumstances that I'm imagining working under. We're talking about a situation where the crap has totally hit the fan. And for instance, like in 1 second after, we may be talking about up to 90% of the American population dying. And this is usually extrapolated out to the rest of the globe. Obviously, some places will weather this kind of situation better, but in general, we're talking about an event where huge chunks of the population are dying and everyone has spent a few years completely isolated and living for themselves. Now, even in the worst case situation, I truly believe that there will still be large pockets of people who have managed to establish some kind of order after a few years and crap hits the fan. And this obviously really depends on whether it's a nuclear winter type of situation or just how hard it is to survive. Now, based on the assumption that it's been a few years after an extremely difficult situation, I do believe that there will still be large groups of government-based and prepper-based and church-based organizations of people who will essentially have some form of order set up in the local area. In the prepper community, I think we often take it for granted that because we won't have any necessary direct contact with these groups or influence over them, we tend to discount the idea that there will be large military bases, aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, church groups, especially gatherings of Mormons, and different groups who will have been able to weather the storm quite well and may even have some form of industry set up. And so for my video, I'm really looking at it from the perspective of someone who has access to these kinds of knowledge and resources. So let's jump into the situation that I imagine and what I think needs to be done to rebuild society after crap hits the fan. Alright, so in my vision for rebuilding society after crap hits the fan, one of my major goals is going to be, in the ultimate long scheme of things, is to establish the international technological and scientific community. Now, this may sound a little silly or nerdy, but there's a very good reason for this. It is only ever since the modern times when the space race finally occurred that, for the large part, the major warring nations have put aside major warfare and worked towards a common goal wherein they can rival each other and compete without expending massive amounts of resources on destruction and loss of life. Especially in an age with nuclear weapons, this was one of the few things that truly saved us from annihilation. And in an age without all of the safeguards that we have in place, but in which nuclear weapons and hostility are still in abundance, this could be crucial as a place that we need to get back to immediately if possible. There are a few other things that can ensure international cooperation, like some of the more advanced technological needs and scientific competition that we engage in nowadays. And for that reason, I think that it is extremely important to quickly get back to something resembling the technological and scientific competitive state that we are currently in. This will take a lot, but all of the things that are required to be an advanced technological and scientific community are things which greatly contribute to quality of life and survivability of a civilization. So let's take a look at what we need to do to get back to something approximating our society now. So let's imagine that I'm just sitting in my own little prepper group a couple of years after the crap has hit the fan, working my ham radio, and I end up coming into contact with the provisional president of the United States. This is the person sitting in the Denver airport or Cheyenne Mountain or wherever have you who has become the leader of the continuity of government. This person has all of the U.S. former military assets at their command. I'm imagining that there are still a few satellites, no matter what the situation, that are working in tandem with ground bases. I'm pretty confident that the U.S. military has figured out how to have at least some of its capabilities last in almost any conceivable situation. So even if it's just once a day that a satellite passes overhead, I'm imagining that during that period of time, they're able to communicate between the various hardened bases that I'm certain will last through most situations. In the prepper community, we often discount a lot of coordinated military activity except in an excessive rule of law situation, because we tend to assume that some of these situations will hit even our military so hard that they could never have possibly prepared for these situations. But I personally am of the belief that there are definitely certain military facilities and private, perhaps corporate-owned facilities which will be set up and in such a position that they, at least in an isolated sense, will continue running at quite a capacity even well into crap hits the fan. These are places with so much resources like fuel and food and vehicles and tools and all of these things stockpiled, and with good continuity of action plans, that they will actually weather most of these situations and be a coherent entity well into a collapse type situation. There will also almost certainly be quite large communities after a few years of a collapse type situation that have gathered. I'm thinking large Mormon communities, large prepper mutual assistance groups that have since formed villages or hamlets or in other ways conglomerated together, or even small towns that are centered around large industries that manage to weather the storm and provide those towns with a modicum of some ability to provide for themselves. So these places will be existing, and even though they will maybe be isolated and completely unknowledgeable of each other, a central command with ability to use maybe a couple of satellites or some kind of communications ability may know about these places and will likely have begun at least having radio contact with them. And so if I find myself in a situation where I'm advising somebody on what to do and they have these resources at hand, here are some of the things that I'm going to tell them. One of the first things that is important at a national level when we're talking about rebuilding society is inventorying what resources exist in the nation. And I'm not talking about resources that we can use right away. I'm talking about what exists. What plants haven't blown up, what reactors haven't melted down, what fuel reserves haven't been completely wiped out, what still exists in this nation, and also what groups are producing what. I'm talking about essentially doing a very rough census. We need to know how many people there are, how many are willing to contribute to the civil good, and what resources are available in this country. And this includes those being held by groups that may be considered to be against the common good. Now, after inventorying resources, so just getting a rough idea of what is out there, I'm going to suggest a muster of assets. In this case, when I talk about mustering our assets, I'm talking about figuring out what resources and capability you have available to you immediately. This is fuel, food, people willing to work with you, etc. This is getting on the radio, establishing communications with every group possible, and telling them that something is up and running, someone is trying to get things working again, and we need to know who is willing to help. Now, this gets into a whole field of whether people are willing to trust you, whether you're a dictator, and all of the political questions of post crap hits the fan. But I'm just going to go ahead and work on the assumption that I know I'm the good guy, and enough people know that I'm the good guy that they're willing to help. So basically, you've got people on the radios and in every form of communications making contact with other groups, figuring out who's willing to work with you and what resources they have and what you have available to really start moving forward. And here's where you start consolidating resources and where the work really begins. Once you have a network of communities ready to begin rebuilding society, you need to start consolidating resources and getting places where industry and actual progress is being made. And this is going to take some real civil progress, civil programs. We're going to need to find ways to locate specialists like engineers, healthcare specialists, etc., and get them to the places where they're needed. And in a crap hits the fan situation, this will be very difficult. We need to provide incentives for people and their families to move places away from their mutual assistance groups, perhaps, and to provide them protection to get to those places, to get power plants running, water treatment facilities running, set up healthcare centers, and that's going to literally be one city in a region where people go to get healthcare taken care of. There may be one central place that has electricity because that's the only place where you're able to get it running, and that's where any industry that truly needs electricity is going to have to go and be set up. We are talking about fundamental shifts in the way that we do things from today and from how we've been doing them in the crap hits the fan situation. And this is going to be one of the major hurdles to rebuilding society, is getting people to leave the so-called security of their bug out locations and from the people that they've survived these situations with perhaps, and to move to a city for a job in the hopes of getting society rebuilt again, and that some major event won't happen, making things worse yet again. But if we're looking at rebuilding society and actually trying to get back to anything like what we have today, it's going to be absolutely necessary to make some really big shifts. So part 3 and part 4, consolidate resources and address weaknesses, are pretty much together, because as you're consolidating your resources and getting your hands on everything that you can, you are identifying your weak links and trying to take care of those things. So the resources that I think need to be consolidated are anything to do with energy and production, agriculture, health, transportation, chemicals, technology production, nuclear facilities, which is in with energy, but I'm also talking about weaponized nuclear technology. So all nuclear missile capabilities, and those will still exist in almost any situations. Most of the major nations have at least some nukes that are capable of operating independently. And I'm also looking at the financial system as something that needs to be consolidated. It's going to be a pretty wild world out there with barter and all of the different mini economies throughout even just one nation. And that's something that somebody needs to try to start working on and getting everybody realizing what's worth what in different locations, because there's just going to be some wild disparities in some of the costs of different goods, even in comparable markets. All right, so some of the most important resources to consolidate and address weaknesses in are going to be agriculture and chemical, health, and energy. Now, I put agriculture and chemical together because you really can't produce enough food for large amounts of people without industrial fertilizers. And so, if you, as a large population, want to rebuild a society, you need to address how you're going to produce a lot of food. And that's going to involve finding your stockpiles of chemical fertilizers and being able to produce more, if you even can at that point. And that's going to take chemical engineers. Beyond that, energy is going to be one of the most important resources, because food production takes a huge amount of energy, mostly in the form of fuel. And for that reason, energy plants like hydroelectric and fuel production are going to be key. But it may not be enough, and for that reason, one of the resources that needs to be consolidated is electric vehicles. Now, before anybody scoffs, it needs to be pointed out that electric vehicles now are quickly becoming a very viable option in a lot of fields. Tesla vehicles are capable of traveling hundreds of miles between charges and charging rather quickly. They can be charged from a home outlet, which means that at least over a slow and long period of time, a vehicle can be charged off of a solar setup. And as technology progresses, this will only become more viable for things like semi-trucks and farm vehicles. And so for that reason, in a world where fuel production may even be an impossibility, electric vehicles will be the way of the future. And for that reason, I think that Tesla and Mr. Musk would be key people to approach about trying to build sustainable communities that will weather the collapse. And that might not be too hard to do, because I hear that Mr. Musk is a prepper. Anyways, you're looking at getting energy, sustainable energy, and all the resources that you need for food production and chemical production. Beyond that, one of our most important things to look at will be healthcare, because a lot of people are going to be dying who have valuable skills, not in a crap hits the fan situation, but in a rebuilding society situation. And you really can't expect people to want to help you if you can't help them. And for that reason, even if it's only isolated cities that are capable of providing healthcare, it is necessary as a national society entity to be able to provide for the well-being of the people that you're trying to protect and provide for. Which means that you're trying to set up a civil infrastructure, which is exactly what we're trying to set up. We need to set up a civil entity that can both provide for people and provide a way for them to contribute to the public good. Now, this is not talking about rebooting the federal government. This is talking about a central organization, whatever you want to call it, that is working towards the societal progression. And if this is done right and with people with the right intentions and without allowing corruption to come into it, which is asking a lot, it will at least be better than having everybody working on their own and fighting each other when they come into contact. So you're establishing the civil infrastructure to provide safety for people who are traveling from one place to another and to compensate them and to control the economies of the places that they go so that those places can begin to establish industry. So in a post-crap is the fan situation, industry is not going to be quite like it is today. It's going to be a lot more like it was in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. You're going to have certain locations that specialize in something. Texas will likely be the oil place. You may have a central location that's the healthcare city. You may have another city that pretty much takes care of production. That might be Detroit or something else, something a little bit more currently suited to that. But you're going to end up with regions that specialize in certain things. This wouldn't be too far unlike the districts in the Mockingjay series. So if things just aren't a purely dystopian post-collapse world, you're going to end up with some places that are specializing in producing certain things. And you're going to start coordinating those resources and establishing trade. First, just regional trade, and then maybe even continental trade. So North and South America, maybe trading technology type things and resources for food production. Maybe even I've imagined America being a center of education for the continent. Now, that may be laughable because people like to laugh at America's state of education compared to the rest of the world. But in a post-collapse situation, if we do manage to set up a modicum of the modern world and we have a somewhat healthy seafaring trade, I could see people from Central and South America sending people to America to gain valuable tech skills to bring back, especially in trade for labor or various other resources, if we manage to produce something viable for a continent which has plenty of fuel resources and food resources, and which, by many estimations, would weather many situations better than the North American part of the continent. Anyways, we're establishing trade between centers of industry and throughout the region and maybe beyond what was originally just the United States. And this is pretty far down the road. But we have to imagine that eventually we're able to get a ship going down the coast or get a rail line that is safe enough to travel across. If that's never going to happen, then there's no point about talking about rebuilding society. We're just always going to be tribal. Anyways, you've got your regional and somewhat international trade going on. You might actually be able to begin some advanced industry. We're talking about technology, digital stuff, things like that that really do require some resources from more than just one place. And this is where we're able to really start looking at talking to people in the international community, establishing communications and trade, maybe even as far as across the ocean, although that will take quite a while to really do in any way that is helping anybody. But anyways, that's pretty much just a rough plan that I came together with what would be some of the biggest steps that need to be taken to getting anywhere close to the international technological and scientific community that we have today, which I see as key to being anything but the nationalistic warring factions that we have been even up into the 1900s. I truly believe that the modern way that we do things, the scientific collaboration and competition that exists today, is one of the key factors in humanity rising up out of the warlike nature that we've had for almost all of our history, and which we still do have today, but which we have come closer to avoiding in recent decades than ever before. In that vein, The reason that I say we need to secure the nuclear weapons isn't because I think that there's ever a situation which I would want to use a nuclear weapon in after crap hits the fan, but because when we're talking about making contact with other nations or what's left of them, one of the first things that they're going to want to know is whether or not our nuclear weapons are secure. And for that reason, it's one of the first things that we need to make sure of in the early stages of responding to crap hits the fan, and hopefully one which will never have been put into question. Anyways, those are my rough steps for what someone should do to rebuild society after crap hits the fan. I know I was a little bit all over the place on this. I just sort of threw these together. I had a lot of ideas that I didn't end up putting in this, and I'm sure that there are a lot of things that any of those other guys would be able to say once they start thinking in this fashion. Anyways, thanks for listening. I hope it was interesting, and stay tuned with Let's Talk About Prepping for future videos. Stay safe out there, everybody.